The text came through at 10:17 on a Thursday night, while I was sitting alone in my garage, polishing brass hinges on an old cedar chest I'd been restoring for nearly 3 months. Outside rain hammered softly against the Marina Road behind my neighborhood, and somewhere beyond the docks, thunder rolled low over the water. 3 words lit up my phone screen. Blue Lantern, then a location pin. My daughter's house? I remember staring at the message long enough for the garage light above my workbench to start buzzing louder in my ears. Not because I didn't understand what it meant, because I understood it immediately. 15 minutes later, I was standing in the rain outside Claire's front door, listening to my 8-year-old granddaughter cry while a man I once trusted shouted inside that house like he owned every frightened soul in it. And somewhere between the sound of that little girl crying and the whiskey-thick rage in my son-in-law's voice, I realized something that still wakes me up some nights. This hadn't started tonight. I was just finally arriving in time to see it. The garage smelled faintly of cedar dust machine oil and old coffee gone cold. My radio sat beside an open toolbox quietly playing Patsy Cline through static, while rainwater streaked down the windows facing the backyard. Most evenings at 67 years old followed the same rhythm. Quiet work with my hands, early dinner, maybe a phone call from Claire if Sophie wanted to tell me about school or dance class or whichever cartoon had become the center of her universe that week. I lived a simple life now, at least that's what people assumed. Most of my neighbors knew me as Maggie Whitmore, retired widow owner of too many gardening tools, and one stubborn golden retriever named Bo. Only a handful of people still remembered Colonel Margaret Whitmore. 30 years Army intelligence, 2 overseas deployments, enough classified briefings to make ordinary conversation feel painfully slow for the rest of my life. Daniel certainly never cared much about my military background. Early in his marriage to Claire, he'd once joked during Thanksgiving dinner that I was America's toughest grandmother. Everybody laughed, including me. But over the years, the jokes shifted. You military people see danger everywhere. You don't have to interrogate every situation. Claire gets anxious because you raised her too cautiously. Always smiling when he said it. Always charming enough that calling him out made you feel unreasonable. I picked up the phone and called Claire immediately. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. My chest tightened hard enough to make breathing uncomfortable. Blue Lantern. Claire hadn't used those words since she was 13 years old. Her father died suddenly from a stroke the summer before 8th grade. One minute, Richard Whitmore was grilling hamburgers in our backyard, complaining about the Braves bullpen, and the next he was collapsing face first onto wet grass while our daughter screamed for somebody to help him. After the funeral, Claire became terrified of silence, terrified of empty rooms, terrified something terrible could happen while nobody noticed. One night she asked me a question I never forgot. What if someday I'm scared and can't say it out loud? So we created a code. Blue Lantern. It meant don't explain, don't waste time, just come. And now 25 years later, my daughter was using it again. I stood so quickly my chair scraped hard across the garage floor. Bo lifted his head from his bed near the washing machine, sensing tension immediately. It's okay, boy, I lied. I grabbed my truck keys, rain jacket, and phone charger in one motion before heading out into the storm. The rain had gotten heavier by then. Savannah roads gleamed black beneath streetlights, while windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm across the glass. I barely noticed the music playing low through the speakers. My thoughts kept circling backward through small moments I should have paid closer attention to. Claire canceling Sunday dinners more often. Sophie growing unusually quiet whenever Daniel entered a room. The way Claire apologized constantly for things that required no apology. At Easter dinner 2 months earlier, Daniel corrected the way she carved ham in front of everybody at the table. Not loudly, worse than loudly, calmly, patiently, like a father embarrassing a child for misunderstanding something simple. Claire laughed too quickly afterward. I remembered watching her refill iced tea with trembling hands, while Sophie stared silently down at her plate. At the time, I told myself marriages were complicated. Adults argued, families carried stress differently. The truth was uglier than that. Sometimes people mistake avoiding conflict for protecting peace. I called Harold Bennett while waiting at a red light near Victory Drive. Harold answered on the second ring, sounding half asleep. Maggie. She used the code. Silence. That woke him up faster than coffee ever could. How bad? I don't know yet. Another pause. Then his voice sharpened, immediately, old instincts sliding back into place. You heading there now? Yes. I'll meet you nearby. Harold Bennett retired from Army CID 12 years ago, though men like him never truly stopped investigating anything. He lived 15 minutes from Claire's subdivision and knew enough about my daughter to understand the seriousness without additional explanation. By the time I crossed into the Georgetown district, rainwater had begun flooding shallow sections along the curb. Expensive brick homes lined quiet streets beneath dripping oak trees. The neighborhood looked exactly like the kind of place Daniel loved, beautiful from a distance. Carefully maintained, every lawn trimmed precisely enough to impress strangers. Claire's porch light glowed pale yellow through the storm. Harold's dark Ford Explorer sat parked half a block away beneath a magnolia tree. He climbed into my passenger seat wearing jeans, boots, and an old army rain jacket zipped halfway to his throat. You armed? He asked quietly. Yes. He nodded once. Neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. Then we heard shouting. Even through rain and closed windows, Daniel's voice carried sharply across the street. Something crashed inside the house. Not long after Sophie started crying. Not loud crying. Scared crying. The kind children make when they're trying very hard not to be heard. Harold looked toward me carefully. Want me to call Savannah PD now? I kept staring at the front door. Kitchen lights burned bright through partially closed blinds. Shadows moved sharply across the walls inside. Then Daniel shouted something that made my stomach turn cold. You think your mother's going to save you? I was already opening the truck door before Harold could answer. Rain soaked through my jacket immediately as we crossed the street, fast but controlled. At our age, people don't run unless something is dying. Halfway up the walkway, I noticed Sophie's little pink bicycle lying sideways near the bushes. One training lesson from years ago flashed through my head unexpectedly. Children abandon toys when fear interrupts routine. By the time I reached the front porch, my heartbeat felt heavy enough to hurt. I opened the door without knocking. The smell hit me first. Whiskey. Burned food. Rain blowing through an open kitchen window somewhere deeper inside the house. Then came the silence. Not true silence. The dangerous kind. The kind that settles over a room immediately after shouting stops. Claire stood near the dining table, clutching one arm tightly against her ribs. Her blonde hair had partially fallen loose from its clip, and there was fresh blood near the corner of her mouth. Sophie hid behind her mother's legs, wearing dolphin print pajama pants and holding a stuffed rabbit against her chest so tightly one ear had bent sideways. And Daniel Hale stood near the kitchen island holding a half-empty bourbon glass, like we'd interrupted an ordinary disagreement that had simply gotten slightly emotional. The moment he saw me, his entire expression changed. Maggie, he said quickly, forcing calm into his voice, this isn't what it looks like. Funny thing about liars, most of them reach for the exact same sentence. Harold stepped quietly inside behind me and closed the front door against the storm. Water dripped from our jackets onto the hardwood floor, while somewhere upstairs a smoke detector chirped low battery warnings every 40 seconds. Sophie saw me first. Grandma! She ran toward me so fast the stuffed rabbit slipped from her hands onto the floor. I bent automatically and caught her against my chest. She was trembling hard enough I could feel it through both our clothes. It's okay, sweetheart, I said softly. Children always know when adults are lying, but sometimes they accept it anyway because they need somewhere safe to place their fear. I glanced toward Harold. Can you stay with Sophie for a minute? He nodded immediately. Hey there, kiddo, Harold said, gently crouching beside her. You think you can help me look for cookies in the kitchen? Sophie looked uncertain until Claire whispered quietly, Go ahead, baby. Only then did she move. Daniel gave a strained little laugh. Everybody's acting like someone died. Nobody answered him. Claire still wouldn't look directly at me. That scared me more than the blood on her lip. I'd raised that girl mostly by myself after Richard died. Claire was stubborn by nature, independent. Even during hard moments, she usually held eye contact like she refused to surrender space emotionally. But that night she kept staring at the floor. Daniel noticed me watching her. "She got upset," he said carefully. "Things got out of hand." Claire flinched slightly when he took a step toward her. Tiny movement. Barely noticeable. But military intelligence work teaches you something most civilians never fully understand. Fear has body language. And once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. I spent years interviewing soldiers returning from combat zones pretending everything was fine. I'd watched trained officers lie through panic attacks with perfectly steady voices while their hands shook beneath conference tables. Claire was terrified. Daniel either didn't realize I saw it or believed charm could still erase it. "She threw a plate at me first," he continued. "You know how emotional she gets." I looked around slowly. Broken ceramic glittered near the living room entrance. One dining chair had been knocked sideways. Something dark stained the kitchen tile near the sink. Wine, maybe, or bourbon. Then I noticed Sophie's coloring book lying open beneath the coffee table. One crayon had snapped cleanly in half. Children stop coloring when adults become dangerous. Maggie Daniel said again, softer this time. "Claire texted you during an argument. That's all this is." Finally, Claire spoke. "No," she whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened instantly. The room changed in that tiny second. Not dramatically, quietly, like pressure building before glass breaks. He turned toward her with controlled irritation. "Claire, don't start." My stomach hardened cold. There it was. Not rage. Ownership. I'd seen that tone before in military courts, in abusive command structures, and frightened marriages hidden behind respectable photographs. The tone men use when they believe another person's emotions are inconveniencing them publicly. I stepped forward slowly. "Did my granddaughter hear you threaten her mother?" Daniel blinked once. "What?" "You heard me." His expression shifted again, annoyance bleeding through the charm now. Nobody threatened anybody. From the kitchen, Sophie's small voice drifted softly toward us. "Mommy was crying." Nobody moved. Daniel set his bourbon glass down harder than necessary against the granite counter. "Sophie shouldn't even be awake right now." Claire immediately looked more frightened after he said that. That reaction told me almost everything I needed to know. Abuse changes entire households into systems of anticipation. Everybody starts measuring moods, predicting explosions, managing tension before it arrives. Especially children. I looked directly at Claire. "Did he hit you?" Long pause. Claire swallowed hard. Then she looked toward Daniel before answering. That was the moment something inside me truly broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet understanding settling into place. This had happened before. "Claire," I said carefully. Daniel interrupted immediately. "You're making this bigger than it is." Harold emerged quietly from the kitchen then. Sophie clung to his hand while holding 2 chocolate chip cookies wrapped in a paper towel. Even in that moment, seeing those cookies nearly destroyed me. Because decent men instinctively comfort frightened children. Dangerous men instinctively resent frightened children for exposing tension. Daniel looked toward Harold sharply. "Who exactly invited him here?" "I did," I answered. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Right, of course. Military backup." Harold ignored the comment completely. "Police are on their way." Daniel's eyes flashed instantly toward Claire. Fear. Not guilt. Fear. That mattered. "Seriously," he snapped. "Claire, you called the cops." "I didn't," she whispered. "I did," Harold said calmly. The anger in Daniel's face vanished so quickly it almost impressed me. Within seconds, his shoulders lowered and his voice softened again into exhausted suburban husband mode. "This is getting ridiculous," he said quietly. "We had an argument, that's all." People like Daniel survive because they understand performance. Not screaming performance. Normalcy performance. He walked toward Claire slowly with open hands like a man trying to comfort his overwhelmed wife. Claire physically leaned backward before catching herself. Daniel noticed. So did I. His face darkened for half a second. Then came the knock at the door. 2 Savannah police officers entered moments later, carrying rain across the hardwood floor with them. A younger officer named Ruiz, and an older woman with tired eyes named Officer Carver. Officer Carver took one look at Claire's face and immediately separated everybody into different rooms. Classic domestic response procedure. Smart woman. While Ruiz spoke with Daniel near the living room, Officer Carver guided Claire carefully toward the kitchen table. "Ma'am," she said gently, "did your husband strike you tonight?" Claire stared down at her own hands. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Nobody spoke. Then Claire made the mistake victims often make. She looked toward Daniel before answering. He gave the smallest shake of his head imaginable. Almost invisible. But not invisible enough. "We both got upset," Claire whispered finally. Officer Carver stayed patient. "I need a clear answer." Claire's breathing became uneven. Sophie moved immediately toward her mother, wrapping both small arms around Claire's waist. That little girl already understood emotional rescue. And suddenly I realized this wasn't one terrible night. This was an entire life my daughter had been surviving quietly, while the rest of us admired family Christmas cards and backyard cookouts. Claire looked at me then for the first time since I arrived. And I swear she looked exactly like she had at 13 years old standing beside her father's casket. Small. Exhausted. Trying not to collapse. "Mom," she whispered, voice shaking badly now, "please don't leave tonight." Claire and Sophie came home with me just after midnight. Not home in the permanent sense, not yet. At that point, everybody was still pretending the night might somehow become temporary if we handled it carefully enough. The police strongly encouraged separation for the evening, but because Claire refused to press charges, Daniel remained at the house. Officer Carver gave Claire a long look before leaving that told me she'd seen this situation many times before. Fear rarely disappears in one night. Especially when love used to live in the same room as the fear. Rain followed us all the way back to Isle of Hope. Sophie fell asleep in my guest room almost immediately after arriving, still clutching that stuffed rabbit under one arm. Harold made grilled cheese sandwiches nobody touched, while Claire stood motionless near my kitchen counter, staring at the coffee maker like she'd forgotten how it worked. I poured her coffee anyway. She wrapped both hands around the mug without drinking. The clock above the stove read 2:13 a.m. Harold finally broke the silence first. "You want me to stay?" Claire answered before I could. "No, thank you." Harold studied her carefully for a moment. "Call if he shows up." She nodded. He squeezed my shoulder gently on his way out the door, and once his truck disappeared down the street, the house became painfully quiet again. Only then did Claire start crying. Not dramatic crying, no sobbing, no collapse. Just exhausted tears sliding silently down her face while she stared into untouched coffee. I moved beside her slowly. "Sweetheart." She covered her mouth immediately like she was embarrassed by the sound of herself breaking apart. That nearly shattered me. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Rain ticked softly against the windows above the sink, while Beau lifted his head from the hallway, sensing tension, but too old now to investigate it closely. Finally, Claire whispered, "Do you think I'm weak?" The question hit harder than anything else that night. Not because of what she asked. Because of how long she must have been carrying it alone before saying it out loud. I leaned against the counter beside her and looked at my daughter carefully. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes I somehow hadn't fully noticed before. Her wedding ring sat crooked on swollen fingers. A bruise had already begun darkening beneath the edge of her jaw. "You survived something difficult," I said quietly. "That isn't weakness." Claire gave a small bitter laugh. "Mom, I stayed." There it was. The shame. Abuse plants shame inside victims so deeply they start apologizing for their own suffering. I'd spent enough years around military trauma counselors to recognize the pattern immediately now that I was finally willing to see it. "How long?" I asked softly. Claire stared down at her coffee. "A while." "How long, Claire?" Another long silence. Then he shoved me the first time after Sophie turned 3. Something physically painful moved through my chest hearing those words. I turned away before she could see my face clearly and walked toward the sink. Outside, lightning flashed pale blue across the backyard. I told myself it was stress. Claire continued quietly behind me, then work pressure, then drinking, then financial problems. I closed my eyes briefly. Excuses, layer after layer of excuses. Not because she was foolish. Because people in pain cling desperately to the version of someone they first loved. When did it get worse? Claire rubbed trembling fingers against her temple. After his promotion 2 years ago. That tracked. Daniel had always loved appearances. Expensive watches, luxury gyms, networking dinners with people who used words like leverage and portfolio in ordinary conversations. At first it looked harmless, ambition usually does. Then came the smaller things. Criticizing Claire's clothes before parties. Correcting her stories publicly. Monitoring spending. Questioning who she texted. Gradually, carefully reducing her confidence one piece at a time. He checked my phone constantly near the end, Claire said. Said married people shouldn't have secrets. And you believed that? She looked embarrassed. Sometimes. That hurt too. Not because I blamed her. Because smart women still get manipulated every single day by men who understand emotional erosion better than violence. Claire swallowed hard before continuing. He'd start arguments before family events. Then afterward everybody would think I was emotional or tired. I remembered Thanksgiving suddenly with awful clarity. Claire dropping gravy because her hands shook. Daniel smiling while making jokes about how sensitive she'd become lately. God. The signs had been everywhere. You should have told me, I whispered before I could stop myself. Instantly Claire stiffened. There it is. I turned toward her. What? That look. Tears filled her eyes again. Like you're disappointed in me. I'm disappointed in him. But I stayed with him. The kitchen fell quiet again. Finally, I moved closer and took both her hands gently in mine. Claire, I said carefully, your father died when you were 13. You spent half your life terrified of losing people. Men like Daniel know exactly how to use fear like that. Her face crumpled immediately after hearing Richard mentioned. For a second, she looked painfully young again. Then she whispered something that made my blood run cold. He used Sophie's college account. I stared at her. What? Claire looked physically sick saying it aloud. He borrowed against it. How much? She didn't answer immediately. That silence told me before the number did. Almost all of it. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table because my knees suddenly didn't feel steady anymore. That account wasn't just money. It was years. Birthdays. Retirement bonuses. Quiet monthly deposits after Richard died. Every extra consulting contract I took after leaving the army. Every decision to drive an older truck instead of buying something new. Not because I was wealthy. Because I wanted Sophie protected from hardship if I could manage it. Claire wiped at her face quickly. He kept saying it was temporary liquidity. The corporate language in that sentence made me nauseous. Liquidity. Not theft. Not betrayal. Liquidity. I laughed once without humor. Jesus Christ. He mixed documents together, she said quietly. Tax forms, investment papers, refinancing approvals. Sometimes he'd ask me to sign things late at night after arguments. Classic overload manipulation. Confuse somebody emotionally first, then present paperwork while they're exhausted and desperate for peace. A knock sounded softly at the back door around 9 o'clock the next morning. Harold stepped inside carrying a cardboard tray of coffees and a yellow legal pad thick with notes. You two eat anything yet? Neither of us answered. He set the coffees down carefully before looking toward Claire. You okay if I ask a few questions? Claire nodded hesitantly. Harold sat across from us calmly. I started checking public records last night. Claire immediately looked nervous. Relax, he said gently, nothing illegal. He flipped open the legal pad. Your husband's spending patterns don't match the income level he claims. I watched Claire's face tighten slowly. Harold continued carefully. Luxury hotel charges, unexplained wire transfers, designer purchases. Then he slid a printed photograph across the table. A brunette woman around 40, laughing beside Daniel outside some rooftop restaurant downtown. Claire stared at the image like somebody had knocked the air from her lungs. Who is she? I asked quietly. Vanessa Cole, Harold answered. Married, real estate executive. Claire covered her mouth. I thought I was imagining it, she whispered. Harold exchanged a glance with me before pulling another folder from beneath his arm. That's not all. He handed several printed pages toward me. Bank summaries. Private consultation invoices. Preliminary divorce paperwork. My stomach turned cold. Daniel had been planning his exit while draining money from the family. Claire looked at the documents for several silent seconds before whispering the saddest sentence I'd heard in years. I kept trying harder. Around noon, another car pulled into my driveway. A tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair stepped onto the porch, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of calm expression expensive attorneys develop after decades around broken families. Naomi Calloway. Harold introduced us quietly. Naomi reviewed paperwork for nearly an hour before finally setting her glasses down carefully on my kitchen table. Then she looked directly at Claire. "Your husband likely committed financial abuse, fraud, and coercive control," she said evenly. "And your daughter still thinks she's the one who failed." Claire stared down at her hands. Naomi's voice softened slightly. "You aren't trapped anymore," she said. "You just haven't realized the door is already open." For the first few days after Claire and Sophie moved into my house, everything felt strangely careful. Not peaceful. Careful. Like all three of us were sharing the same fragile glass floor, and nobody wanted to be the person who stepped too hard first. Claire slept lightly and woke at every unexpected sound. Sophie followed her mother from room to room without seeming aware she was doing it. Even Beau started positioning himself near their bedroom doors at night like old dogs sometimes do when they sense wounded people inside a home. Meanwhile, Daniel transformed into several different men depending on the hour. At 7 o'clock in the morning, he sent apology texts. "I'm so sorry I lost control. Please tell Sophie I love her." By afternoon, the messages shifted. "You're humiliating me. Your mother is poisoning this situation. Families fight Claire." Then came the guilt. "Sophie deserves both parents under one roof. You know, divorce destroys children." And finally, anger. "Nobody else is going to tolerate your anxiety forever." That one nearly made me drive directly to his office. Instead, I sat alone in my garage, sanding the edge of an antique bookshelf while trying to remember every lesson the Army ever taught me about restraint. Discipline matters most when rage feels justified. Naomi arrived 3 days later carrying 2 thick folders and wearing the same composed expression surgeons probably wear before difficult operations. Claire sat across from her at my dining table, still wearing one of my old Savannah State sweatshirts with her hair loosely tied back. She looked exhausted but different now. Less frightened, more alert somehow. Like somebody slowly waking up after years underwater. Naomi opened the first folder carefully. "I spoke with a forensic accountant this morning." Claire visibly tensed. "Relax," Naomi said gently. "This isn't catastrophic, but it's worse than we initially thought." Harold leaned silently against the kitchen counter, drinking black coffee while rain drifted softly across the marina outside. Naomi slid several printed spreadsheets toward us. "Daniel has been submitting false reimbursement requests through his firm for at least 18 months. I stared at the pages. Luxury hotel charges, restaurant expenses, car services, jewelry purchases. Thousands of dollars. Claire looked pale. He told me we were struggling financially. "People like Daniel build entire identities around appearances," Naomi replied calmly. "Once maintaining the image becomes more important than reality, ethical lines disappear quickly." Harold tapped one highlighted section with his finger. "There's also a leased apartment downtown." Claire closed her eyes briefly. Not dramatic. Just tired. I realized then that, somewhere deep down, she'd already known about the affair long before any proof appeared. Most spouses do. They simply spend years trying to negotiate emotionally with evidence they don't want confirmed. "When did you first suspect?" I asked quietly. Claire stared out the window toward the water. "About a year ago." "Why didn't you confront him?" She laughed softly without humor. "I did." The room stayed quiet. "He convinced me I was paranoid," she continued. "Then he bought flowers, booked a weekend trip, acted perfect for 3 weeks. That tracked too. Cruel men rarely stay cruel constantly. If they did, leaving would feel simpler. No, the dangerous ones understand timing. Cruelty, affection, humiliation, apology. Repeat long enough and confusion becomes emotional prison bars." Claire rubbed at her temples slowly. "Sometimes I honestly couldn't tell whether I was overreacting anymore." Naomi leaned forward slightly. "That's intentional." Claire looked up. "Coercive partners destabilize confidence gradually," Naomi explained. "The goal isn't just control, it's dependency." I watched my daughter absorb those words carefully. Not because they were new, because hearing somebody else describe her reality made it harder to excuse anymore. Later that afternoon, Sophie sat on my back porch, drawing dolphins with sidewalk chalk, while Claire helped me fold laundry in the guest room. Simple things suddenly carried strange emotional weight now. Normal activities. Safe routines. Quiet. I forgot how peaceful this house feels, Claire admitted softly. I folded one of Sophie's sweaters carefully before answering. Peace shouldn't feel unfamiliar. That sentence seemed to stay with her. Over the next week, small changes began happening almost invisibly. Claire opened her own checking account. Changed passwords. Started answering calls from old friends she'd slowly disappeared from over the years. One evening I overheard her laughing on the phone with a former coworker from the elementary school where she used to teach art classes. The sound stopped me cold halfway through the hallway. I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd heard my daughter laugh naturally. Meanwhile, Daniel became increasingly unpredictable. One night he left a voicemail crying. The next morning he accused Claire of kidnapping Sophie emotionally. Another day, flowers arrived at my front porch with a handwritten note. I miss my family. 2 hours later he texted, "You've embarrassed me in front of everyone I know." The emotional whiplash would have been exhausting for anybody. For someone already traumatized, it became disorienting enough to feel almost physically dangerous. Harold stopped by often during that period, never intrusive, just present. Retired investigators understand something younger people sometimes miss. Support doesn't always require speeches. Sometimes it's enough to quietly occupy space beside frightened people until they stop feeling alone. One evening he sat with me in lawn chairs facing the marina while Sophie chased fireflies across the backyard. "You blaming yourself yet?" he asked without looking at me. "Yes." "Good, means you're honest." I almost smiled. Then his tone softened slightly. "But don't confuse missing signs with causing them." The problem was I had seen signs. I just softened them into more comfortable explanations. Claire canceling family visits. Sophie flinching at sudden noises. Daniel embarrassing Claire publicly in tiny socially acceptable ways. I remembered a dinner party nearly 8 months earlier where Daniel spent half the evening complimenting a younger realtor's dress, while Claire quietly cleared plates alone in the kitchen. At the time, I almost confronted him. Claire begged me afterward not to. "Please don't make this worse, Mom." Now those words replayed differently in my head. Not embarrassment. Fear. 3 nights later, Daniel finally showed up at my house unannounced. I saw his BMW pull into the driveway just before sunset. Claire froze immediately from the kitchen window. Fear still moved through her body before thought did. That alone made me open the front door before he reached it. Daniel stood on my porch wearing an expensive charcoal coat despite the humid Georgia evening. He looked exhausted but carefully composed, like a man trying very hard to remain sympathetic. "I just want to talk to my wife. She doesn't want to talk tonight." His jaw tightened slightly. "You don't get to decide that." Actually, I did. Not permanently, not legally. But inside my house, absolutely. "She's had enough pressure for 1 week." Daniel laughed softly. "You know, Maggie, this whole military protector thing might work on Claire, but you're making everything worse." There it was again. That careful arrogance. The assumption that calm women become controllable women. I stepped onto the porch fully, then closing the door gently behind me. Rain clouds gathered low over the marshlands nearby while porch lights flickered across neighboring homes. "You know what your biggest mistake was?" I asked quietly. Daniel folded his arms, enlightened me. "You confused kindness with weakness." For the first time since I'd known him, I watched uncertainty flicker briefly across his face. Only briefly. Then the confidence returned. "She'll come back," he said. "Eventually she'll realize nobody else is going to put up with all this emotional instability." I stared at him for several long seconds. Then I answered with absolute honesty. "The woman you married survived losing her father at 13, raising a child largely alone emotionally, and spending years protecting your reputation while you dismantled her confidence piece by piece." Daniel's expression hardened. "You don't know everything." "No," I said softly, "but I know enough." He looked toward the house one last time before stepping backward off the porch. "This isn't over." I watched his taillights disappear down the street before realizing something quietly important. For the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't afraid of him anymore. 3 weeks later, Daniel Hale walked into the Savannah Harbor Children's Foundation Gala, believing his life was still salvageable. That was the tragic thing about men like Daniel. Even when everything starts collapsing around them, they still assume charm will eventually reopen the right doors. The gala happened every spring inside the Grand Ballroom at the Riverfront Marriott overlooking the Savannah River. Wealthy donors, local executives, medical investors, old Southern families pretending not to judge each other while absolutely judging each other. Soft jazz floated through crystal chandeliers, while waiters carried trays of bourbon-glazed shrimp beneath conversations polished smooth by money and social performance. I hadn't attended one of those events since Richard died. Back then, charity galas still felt like community gatherings. Now they felt like theater. Claire almost backed out that afternoon while getting ready upstairs in my bedroom. "I don't want a scene," she admitted quietly while fastening small pearl earrings in front of the mirror. Naomi stood beside her, adjusting the cuff of her navy dress. "You aren't creating the scene," she said calmly. "You're simply refusing to protect it anymore." Claire stared at herself silently for several moments after that. Then, without saying anything, she slid her wedding ring off slowly and left it beside my jewelry tray. Small moment. Huge meaning. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom was already crowded with expensive smiles and strategic networking. Harold stood near the back bar nursing Club Soda, while quietly observing the room the same way retired investigators always observe rooms. I kept my appearance simple. Dark slacks, cream blouse, one silver bracelet Richard bought me during our first assignment overseas 38 years earlier. No military pins, no medals, no attempt to project authority. Half the people there probably assumed I was somebody's widowed aunt attending for free salmon and polite conversation. Perfect. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later with Vanessa Cole on his arm. The room noticed immediately. Upper-middle-class America has its own strange ecosystem around public scandal. Everybody sees everything. Nobody says anything out loud until enough evidence accumulates to make silence socially inconvenient. Vanessa wore a silver dress that probably cost more than my first car. Daniel looked polished and confident in a tailored black tuxedo, moving through the ballroom shaking hands like a politician during campaign season. At one point, I overheard him laughing loudly beside 2 investment managers near the auction tables. "Big opportunities coming this summer," he said. "Things are finally moving in the right direction." Harold muttered beside me, "Man could drown in a bird bath and still think he invented water." I nearly smiled. Then Daniel saw us. His expression changed instantly. Not fear. Annoyance. Like I'd shown up wearing muddy boots to his private fantasy. "Well," he said while approaching with a bourbon glass in hand, "didn't expect military grandmother night." I sipped iced tea calmly. "How's downtown parking these days?" That irritated him immediately because I wasn't playing the emotional game he wanted. Vanessa shifted awkwardly beside him. She knew enough by then to feel uncomfortable, but probably not enough to fully understand how much danger already circled Daniel's carefully constructed life. He leaned slightly closer toward me. "Claire really shouldn't be here tonight. She's emotionally fragile right now." There it was. The setup. Plant doubt publicly before truth arrives. Classic manipulation strategy. I looked him directly in the eye. "My daughter seems clearer than she's been in years." His smile tightened almost invisibly. "Well," he replied softly, "I suppose everybody needs comforting stories." Then he walked away. But not before checking over his shoulder twice. Tiny crack. Pressure had already begun building beneath the surface by then. Earlier that week, Naomi quietly forwarded documented reimbursement irregularities to Daniel's firm. No dramatic accusations, just enough financial inconsistencies to trigger internal review procedures. Separately, Vanessa's husband received evidence regarding the affair. No elaborate revenge scheme. No movie-style sabotage. Just truth moving slowly through the correct channels. Real consequences rarely arrive dramatically at first. They spread quietly, like water underneath a locked door. By 8:15 that evening, tension had already started shifting through the ballroom in subtle ways. Conversations paused abruptly when Daniel approached. Phones checked notifications more frequently. One senior partner from his firm stopped returning his eye contact entirely. Vanessa noticed it too. She kept scanning the room nervously while Daniel drank more heavily, trying to maintain control of conversations. Then her husband arrived. Thomas Cole was tall, controlled, and dressed in the kind of understated tuxedo wealthier men often prefer because they no longer need to advertise money loudly. He walked directly toward Vanessa without hesitation. No shouting. No public theatrics. Just calm devastation. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Vanessa went pale immediately. Daniel stepped forward fast. "Thomas, this isn't the place." Thomas looked at him with absolute disgust. "You spent 8 months sleeping with my wife using company-funded hotel rooms. I think any place works fine." Several nearby conversations died instantly. That's the thing about public humiliation. People pretend not to stare while staring harder than ever. Vanessa grabbed Thomas's arm, trying to pull him away quietly, but the damage had already spread through the room like smoke. Across the ballroom, I noticed 2 men in dark suits entering through the side doors. Company investigators. Right on schedule. Daniel saw them too. For the first time all evening, genuine panic crossed his face. One investigator approached carefully. "Mr. Hale, we need a private conversation." Daniel laughed too loudly. About what? Expense discrepancies and unauthorized reimbursements. Nearby guests suddenly became fascinated by their wine glasses. Nobody intervened. Nobody defended him. That's another thing people misunderstand about social collapse. Once respect disappears, isolation happens astonishingly fast. Daniel looked around the ballroom, searching for control that no longer existed. Then Claire entered. The room shifted again immediately. She wore a simple dark blue dress with her hair pulled back softly away from her face. No dramatic makeup, no revenge energy, no visible fear anymore either. Just calm. And the second Daniel saw that calm expression, I think he finally understood he was losing something he couldn't manipulate back into place. He moved toward her immediately. "Claire, tell them this is ridiculous." She didn't answer. "You've blown this completely out of proportion." Still nothing. People openly watched now. The polished image he'd spent years constructing was cracking too quickly for him to manage. Then he made the mistake narcissistic men always make once panic overwhelms performance. His voice rose. "Your mother poisoned this marriage against me." Claire looked at him quietly for several seconds. No anger. No tears. Honestly, that frightened him more. Finally, she spoke. "I protected you for years." The ballroom had gone nearly silent around us. Daniel swallowed hard. "Claire. But I'm done doing that now." Simple sentence. Devastating sentence. Daniel looked toward me then. Not furious anymore. Desperate. Like maybe another adult in the room would still rescue him from consequences if he explained himself correctly enough. I said nothing. Security had already begun drifting closer beside the investigators. One investigator spoke carefully again. "Mr. Hale, we need you to come with us." Daniel tried one final time to regain control. "This is because of her," he snapped, pointing toward me. "She never liked me." Nobody answered. Not even Vanessa. As security escorted Daniel toward the ballroom exit, he kept looking backward like the room itself had betrayed him. But the truth was simpler than that. His lies had finally run out of places to stand. Claire exhaled slowly beside me after the doors closed behind him. Not relief exactly. Something quieter. Release. I touched her hand gently. "You okay?" She looked across the ballroom where conversations had already begun, restarting in careful whispers. Then she answered with complete honesty. "I think this is the first time in years I've stopped being afraid of him." 4 months after the gala, I stood barefoot in my kitchen making blueberry pancakes, while Sophie sat at the counter explaining why sea turtles were more emotionally mature than sharks. Her reasoning had several flaws, but she delivered it with such conviction that I let the matter stand. "Sharks just bite things," she said, drawing a green turtle on the back of an old grocery receipt. "Sea turtles think first." "That right?" She nodded seriously. "Definitely." The morning sun came through the kitchen windows in clean yellow stripes, warming the tile floor beneath my feet. Beau lay beside the refrigerator, pretending to sleep while waiting for someone to drop bacon. The coffee machine hissed quietly. Somewhere outside, a boat motor coughed to life near the marina. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds. You don't understand how sacred ordinary becomes until you've lived long enough around chaos. Saturday mornings had become our thing by then. Pancakes, cartoons playing low in the living room, Sophie stealing chocolate chips from the bowl when she thought I wasn't looking, Claire sleeping a little later than usual because rest had finally started finding its way back into her body. That still moved me more than I expected. For years my daughter had looked awake but not rested, present but not settled, like part of her attention was always listening for footsteps in another room. Now some mornings she actually slept through the trash truck rumbling outside. That was progress nobody put in legal documents. Claire walked into the kitchen wearing gray sweatpants and one of my old army hoodie's hair pulled loosely into a knot at the back of her neck. "Morning," she said. There was color in her face again. Not glamorous, not cinematic. Just alive. That caught me off guard sometimes. For a long while, Claire had looked like somebody surviving her own house. Now she looked tired in ordinary ways. Mother tired, teacher tired, human tired, not frightened. "Coffee?" I asked. "Please." She poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter watching Sophie press too much purple crayon onto the turtle's shell. "Therapy go okay yesterday?" I asked carefully. Claire nodded. "Hard, but okay." That was usually how she described it. Hard, but okay. I'd learned not to push for more unless she offered it. Protection had limits, love did too, though people don't like admitting that. Sometimes loving an adult child means standing close enough to help without reaching into wounds they're still learning to tend themselves. The legal mess around Daniel moved slower than television would have you believe. There was no single satisfying courtroom speech, no judge slamming a gavel while justice arrived in a clean, dramatic package. Real life mostly moved through paperwork delays, phone calls, revised filings, and small, humiliating truths repeated in sterile conference rooms. Daniel's firm terminated him quietly after internal audits confirmed falsified reimbursements and unauthorized expenses. Thomas Cole filed for divorce from Vanessa within weeks. Naomi pushed hard on financial recovery, custody protections, and documentation of coercive control. Claire focused on smaller things. Opening mail without shaking. Taking Sophie to school alone. Choosing a new phone plan. Buying a dress because she liked it, not because Daniel would approve it. Those were victories. Not the kind strangers applaud, but the kind that put a person back inside her own life, one decision at a time. One afternoon in late June, I found Claire standing in the guest room doorway, holding a framed family photo from 2 Christmases earlier. Daniel smiled broadly in the picture, one arm around Claire, one hand resting on Sophie's shoulder. Claire looked beautiful at first glance. Anyone would have thought so. Red sweater, soft makeup, polite smile. But once you knew what to look for, the photograph changed. Her shoulders were tight. Sophie leaned subtly away from Daniel. Claire's hand gripped her own wrist so hard her knuckles looked pale. "I hate that picture," Claire said quietly. I stood beside her. "Then don't keep it." She looked at me like the thought hadn't occurred to her. A minute later, she walked outside and dropped the frame into the trash bin beside the garage. No speech. No tears. Just glass and wood hitting plastic with a dull thud. Healing arrived like that sometimes. Quietly. Almost rudely. A few weeks after the gala, Claire found part-time work at an elementary school art program in Wilmington Island. Nothing prestigious. 3 afternoons a week helping kids paint lopsided birds and clay bowls no parent could identify without assistance. But the first day she came home with blue paint on her wrist and a real smile on her face, I walked into my garage afterward and cried for 10 straight minutes where nobody could see me. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Because something inside her had started moving forward again. That mattered more than revenge ever could. For a while after Daniel's public collapse, I thought satisfaction would come from watching him lose things. His job, his apartment, his image, the admiration he'd polished like silver for years. And some part of me did feel satisfaction. I won't lie about that. But it didn't last as long as I expected. What stayed longer was guilt. I kept replaying old moments with cruel new clarity. Claire canceling family visits. Sophie refusing sleepovers. Daniel speaking to my daughter in that calm, cutting tone while everyone else pretended not to notice. I had mistaken discomfort for privacy. I had let politeness delay concern. One evening while Claire and I sat on the back porch watching rain move slowly across the water, I finally said it. I should have pushed harder. She didn't answer right away. Rain tapped softly against the porch roof. Across the marina, sailboats rocked gently against their lines. "You did see parts of it," she said. "Not enough." Claire looked down into her tea. "You saw what I let you see." That hurt because it was true. Abuse turns families into careful stage productions. Everybody learns a role. Claire's role had been keeping peace. Daniel's had been controlling the room. Sophie's had been staying small. Mine, I suppose, had been respecting boundaries until boundaries became walls. "I'm sorry," I said. Claire reached over and took my hand. "I know." That was all. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't arrive as a grand emotional release. Sometimes it's just 2 words and a hand staying where it is. By late summer, Sophie started sleeping with her bedroom door open instead of closed. Claire noticed before I did. She says she likes hearing the house, Claire told me one morning. I nodded like that didn't nearly undo me. The house had sounds worth trusting now. Coffee brewing before sunrise, Beau snoring in the hallway, Sophie humming while brushing her teeth, Claire laughing softly at something on her phone. Peace. Real peace. Not silence covering pain. Not people walking carefully around one man's temper. Actual peace. And for the first time in years, my daughter and granddaughter weren't surviving a home. They were living in one. Daniel called one final time near the end of August. "Blocked number?" I answered without thinking, because I was standing on the back porch trimming dead leaves from a potted hibiscus, and for one careless second I assumed it might be the pharmacy or Sophie's school. "Maggie." His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Not broken in a dramatic way, just worn down, stripped of polish. Like a man who had spent months discovering that charm only works on people still willing to be charmed. I didn't say anything at first. Across the yard, Sophie rode her bike slowly in uneven circles, while Claire sat on the porch steps pretending to read a book. She wasn't reading much. She was watching Sophie smiling every time that little girl corrected her own balance without help. That was one of Claire's new habits, noticing small recoveries. "You still there?" Daniel asked. "I'm here. I need to talk to Claire." "Number." A long silence followed. The old Daniel would have filled it immediately. He would have argued, explained, accused, reframed the situation until the conversation became a maze built around his feelings. This Daniel only breathed into the phone. I lost everything he said finally. I looked past the porch railing toward the marina. The afternoon water glittered beneath late summer sun, and a heron stood motionless near the reeds like some old judge waiting for confession. "You lost what you used," I said. "That's not fair." "No," I answered quietly. "What you did wasn't fair." He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You always thought you were better than me." "No, Daniel, I thought you were family." That silenced him. For a second I remembered the younger man he used to be, the one who brought Claire soup when she had the flu, the one who stayed up all night in the NICU after Sophie was born too early, holding that tiny baby against his chest, like prayer had weight. I remembered believing my daughter had chosen someone steady. That memory still hurt. Because people rarely become monsters all at once. Sometimes they become smaller first, meaner, more hungry for admiration, more willing to punish anyone who reflects their failure back at them. "I loved her," Daniel said. Maybe that was true. That's the complicated part nobody wants in revenge stories. Sometimes people cause terrible damage to people they genuinely believe they love. But belief doesn't repair bruises. It doesn't refill stolen accounts. It doesn't give a child back the years she spent listening for footsteps. "You probably did," I said. He seemed confused by that. "Then why are you doing this?" "I'm not doing anything now." "You turned her against me." "No," I said calmly. "You taught her to be afraid of you. I just helped her remember she didn't have to stay that way." There was another silence, longer this time. Then his voice lowered. "Can you at least tell Sophie I'm sorry?" I watched Sophie wobble, straighten herself, and keep pedaling. Claire clapped from the porch steps, and Sophie grinned like she'd won something enormous. She's 8, I said. She doesn't need your apology carried through someone else. She needs you to become the kind of man who understands why she needed safety from you. Daniel said nothing. For once there was nowhere for his words to go. Finally he whispered, I don't know how to fix this. That was the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say. I looked at Claire then. She must have felt my eyes on her because she glanced up from her book. Her face changed when she saw the phone at my ear. Not panic, not the old fear. Awareness. I covered the receiver slightly and said, it's him. Claire looked toward Sophie, then toward the water, then back at me. After a moment she shook her head. Number. One small movement. Complete sentence. I uncovered the phone. She doesn't want to talk. Daniel breathed out slowly. Tell her I loved her. No, I said. That's something you want said for yourself. Then I hung up. My hands were steadier than I expected. Claire walked onto the porch beside me after a minute. What did he say? I told her most of it. Not all. Some things don't need to be passed along simply because they were spoken. She listened quietly, arms folded loosely across her chest. When I finished, she nodded once. Then she said I don't hate him anymore. That surprised me. Claire noticed and smiled faintly. I don't forgive him either, she said. I just don't want to carry him around every day. I looked at my daughter for a long time. There are moments when your children become adults in front of you all over again. Not because they get older, because they choose peace over proof, distance over drama, a future over the exhausting need to make someone understand the damage they caused. That sounds healthy, I said. She laughed softly. Don't sound so shocked. Later that evening, Sophie and I sat on the dock eating melting orange popsicles while the sun dropped behind the marina. Claire had gone inside to take a phone call from Naomi about the final custody agreement. The air smelled like salt-cut grass and gasoline from a boat engine somewhere down the canal. Sophie kicked her heels gently against the dock boards. Grandma. Yes, baby. Were you a hero in the army? I smiled at that. 30 years in uniform teaches you many things, but it does not teach you how to answer a child who believes rescue is the same thing as heroism. No, I said finally, not the way you mean. She frowned, but Mom says you saved us. A breeze moved softly across the water. Somewhere behind us, Bo barked once at absolutely nothing. I thought about Blue Lantern, about Claire's shaking hands around a coffee mug, about Sophie's little bicycle tipped over in the rain, about all the signs I missed because asking harder questions felt intrusive at the time. Heroes aren't always brave people, I told her. Sometimes they're just people who show up when somebody scared asks for help. Sophie considered that very seriously, then nodded like I'd handed her important information. That night after everyone went to sleep, I sat alone on the back porch with one last cup of coffee cooling beside me. The house behind me was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that hides pain. This quiet felt earned. If this story stays with you, I hope it reminds you to pay attention when someone you love begins disappearing into themselves. Ask the difficult question. Make the phone call. Show up before silence becomes their only way of surviving. And if you've ever had to start over quietly, or if someone once showed up for you when you needed them most, share your thoughts below. Tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes the stories that hurt the most are also the ones that remind us